Welcome to Tunacheki Africa True Story. The intensifying conflict in Ukraine has raised the issue of racism not only in the country but Europe as a whole. Since the post-World War II period, national liberation movements and independent countries in Africa have developed solid diplomatic and economic relations with the former Soviet Union and today's Russia Federation. It is this history which underlies the recent refusal of numerous African governments and mass organizations to side with the United States and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in its effort to encircle Russia in order to leave it as a diminished state dependent upon the dominant imperialist nations globally. This refusal was shown also when the UN General Assembly recently voted to suspend Russia from its Human Rights Council following allegations of war crimes by Kremlin troops in Ukraine. But African diplomats did not widely back the move. Compared to the vote on the resolution to condemn the invasion that was held in early March, more African countries abstained and voted against the decision this time. One reason Africa decided to widely abstain from the vote is seen in the immediate aftermath of the beginning of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, with the racist treatment of approximately 16,000 African students as well as thousands of others from Asia and the Middle East gaining international news coverage. These descriptions and news reports saw Ukrainian refugees being positioned as more civilian and superior to refugees from Africa and Middle East. The coverage strongly implied that blue-eyed Ukrainian lives were worth more valuable and deserving than the lives of millions of others who seek refuge during this conflict. Africans were denied admission into trains, refused food provided by Ukrainians, while attempting to seek refuge in neighboring countries such as Poland and Romania. These incidents should not have been surprising considering the expansion and institutionalization of fascist and Nazi ideology among those governing the Ukrainian state since the US backed the Euromaidan coup of February 2014. Recently, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine reached out to the African Union for support in his nation's war with Russia, calling his Senegalese counterpart Macky Sall to discuss the crisis. Zelensky said he provided an update to Sall, the current president of the AU, on the Ukrainian struggle against Russia, which has shown hypocrisy and huge double standards from Ukraine. The first-person accounts of the African students who were more than willing to speak out about what had been done to them in Ukraine had to be swiftly suppressed in the Western media as exaggerated news. In this current crisis, white supremacists such as Right Sector and the Azov Brigade's battalions have been training Ukrainian civilians for guerrilla-style combat with the Russian military. Research suggests racism and xenophobia varies with the relationship between hostile government policies and anti-migrant sentiments of the population. In short, the problem of racism is not just Ukraine or Eastern Europe, it is all over Europe. This has been seen through global news coverage portraying the Ukrainian refugees as more life-deserving than their African counterparts, thus demonstrating an example of everyday racism. Reports recently surfaced that African students who have fled Ukraine have been detained by EU border authorities in what has been condemned as discriminatory. Ukraine residents of African origin who have crossed the border to escape the war have been placed in closed facilities, with some having been there for a number of weeks. Africans have been attending school in what is now Ukraine since the 1920s, and in 1957, the Soviet Union, now Russia, began openly recruiting Africans for college and professional schools. The Soviet Union intended to improve relations with African countries and show off their expanding diplomacy to the rest of the world. With all this, the treatment of African refugees in Ukraine left many questions unanswered. If this is what happens in public light, what do these students face on a daily basis in the country when the world is not watching? Following the reports of mistreatment and racial profiling of Africans in Ukraine, African governments evacuated their nationals, although others are still stuck in Ukraine and many held in European detention centers for reasons unknown. Most of the evacuees were medical students hoping to finish their studies. Some important lessons to take from the Russia-Ukraine conflict is first that no single ethnic, racial, or religious group has a great capacity for civilization, personal dignity, or citizenship than others. Second, Europe is still a very racist society and racism is ingrained deep in their culture. Thirdly, all international institutions such as the United Nations, World Bank, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, you name it, are Western vessels used to protect the current status quo of white supremacy. And finally, at the end of the day, Africans are alone in the struggle for freedom. Thanks for watching.